Sarah Martinez never planned to become a legend. At 26 years old, she stood barely 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighed less than most of the equipment the Navy SEALs carried on their backs. But what she lacked in size, she made up for in something that couldn't be measured on any scale or calculated by any formula. Growing up in a small town in Arizona, Sarah learned early that life wasn't fair. Her father left when she was 8, leaving her mother to raise 3 children on a waitress salary. Money was always tight, but her mother, Maria, never let them feel poor in spirit. Every morning before school, Maria would look each of her children in the eye and say the same thing: remember who you are, respect yourself, and the world will follow. Those words became Sarah's foundation, especially during the difficult teenage years when other kids teased her about her secondhand clothes and packed lunches that were often just peanut butter sandwiches. Instead of shrinking away or fighting back with anger, Sarah developed something more powerful. She learned to stand tall in her truth, to meet mockery with quiet confidence, and to never apologize for who she was. Her path to the military began in an unexpected way. During her senior year of high school, a Marine recruiter came to speak at a career day assembly. Most students were bored, checking their phones or whispering to friends. But Sarah listened to every word as Staff Sergeant Rodriguez talked about service, honor, and the chance to be part of something bigger than yourself. After the presentation, Sarah approached the recruiter. "I want to know more about the Marines," she said simply. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez looked at the petite teenager standing before him and probably saw what everyone else saw: a small girl from a small town with big dreams that might be too big for reality. But something in Sarah's eyes made him take a second look. "Military life is tough," he said honestly, "especially for women. Are you sure you're ready for that kind of challenge?" Sarah's response surprised him. "Sir, I've been preparing for challenges my whole life. The question isn't whether I'm ready. The question is whether the military is ready for me." That conversation changed everything. Sarah enlisted in the Marines immediately after graduation, despite her mother's tears and her friends' disbelief. Basic training at Paris Island was everything the recruiter had warned her about, and more. Drill sergeants who seemed to take special pleasure in making her life difficult. Physical challenges that pushed her small frame to its absolute limits. Mental pressure that would have broken many people twice her size. But Sarah had something that couldn't be taught or trained: an unbreakable core of self-respect that had been forged in the fires of a difficult childhood. When drill sergeants screamed in her face, she stood straighter. When other recruits doubted her abilities, she simply proved them wrong through action rather than argument. When the physical demands seemed impossible, she found ways to use her intelligence and determination to overcome what she lacked in raw strength. Her drill instructors noticed. Fellow recruits noticed. But most importantly, Sarah discovered something about herself that would define the rest of her life. She performed best under pressure, and she never backed down from a challenge, no matter how impossible it seemed. After basic training, Sarah excelled in every assignment. She volunteered for the most difficult missions and consistently outperformed expectations. Her small stature became an advantage in certain situations, allowing her to move through spaces others couldn't and remain undetected when stealth was crucial. But it was her mental toughness that really set her apart. In high-stress situations where others might panic or make poor decisions, Sarah became calmer and more focused. Her commanding officers began to rely on her judgment and her ability to stay cool under fire. 5 years into her Marine career, Sarah heard about a special program that would change her trajectory forever. The military was experimenting with cross-training initiatives, allowing exceptional personnel from different branches to train with elite units and share knowledge and techniques. Sarah applied for the program that would place her with Navy SEALs for advanced tactical training. The application process alone was grueling, requiring physical and mental evaluations that eliminated 90% of candidates. When Sarah received her acceptance letter, she was one of only 12 people selected from thousands of applicants. The program was scheduled to take place at the Naval Special Warfare Command facility in California. Sarah would spend 6 months training alongside some of the most elite warriors in the world, learning techniques and strategies that few people outside the special operations community would ever see. She arrived at the facility on a Monday morning in September, carrying her single duffel bag and the same quiet confidence that had carried her through every challenge in her life. The base was massive, filled with buildings and training facilities that spoke to the serious nature of the work done there. As Sarah walked toward the main administration building to check in, she could feel eyes on her. Groups of SEALs stopped their conversations to watch the small woman walking across the compound with her head held high and her shoulders squared. Some looked curious. Others looked skeptical. A few looked openly hostile. Sarah had faced skepticism before. She knew that in a community where physical strength and intimidation were often valued above all else, her presence would be questioned. But she also knew that actions spoke louder than appearances, and she was ready to prove herself through performance rather than posturing. The commanding officer who briefed her was respectful, but direct. "Martinez, you're here because your record speaks for itself. But I'll be honest with you. Some of the men aren't happy about this program. They think it's political correctness gone too far. You're going to face resistance." Sarah nodded. "Sir, I've faced resistance my whole life. It's never stopped me before, and it won't stop me now." "Good. But remember, this isn't just about you. Your performance here will influence whether this program continues and whether other qualified personnel get the same opportunity. No pressure, but you're representing more than just yourself." That evening, Sarah settled into her quarters and prepared for what she knew would be the most challenging 6 months of her military career. She had no way of knowing that in just 3 weeks, she would face a situation that would test everything she believed about herself, about respect, and about what it truly means to stand your ground when the whole world seems to be against you. The first 2 weeks of training went better than expected. While some SEALs remained skeptical of her presence, others began to respect her skills and dedication. Sarah proved herself capable in every exercise, from marksmanship to tactical planning to underwater operations. She didn't try to match the men in pure strength, but she found ways to accomplish every mission using intelligence, technique, and sheer determination. But beneath the surface, tensions were building. A group of SEALs, led by a senior petty officer named Jackson, made no secret of their belief that women didn't belong in special operations. They never directly confronted Sarah, but they made comments within her hearing about lowered standards and political agendas. Sarah ignored the comments and focused on her training. She had learned long ago that the best response to doubt was excellence, and she was determined to give her critics no ammunition for their arguments. Then came the day that would change everything. It started like any other day, with morning physical training followed by classroom instruction on advanced tactical techniques. But the afternoon schedule included something different, a demonstration of close-quarters combat techniques that would be conducted in front of nearly 300 SEALs and other special operations personnel. Sarah was selected to participate in the demonstration, partly because of her excellent performance in previous training, and partly because the instructors wanted to showcase the diversity and capabilities of modern military personnel. She was excited about the opportunity to demonstrate her skills in front of such a large and experienced audience. As she prepared for the demonstration, Sarah had no idea that some members of the audience had spent the morning discussing their displeasure with her presence and their intention to make a statement about women in special operations. She didn't know that what was supposed to be a routine training demonstration was about to become a defining moment that would test everything she had learned about courage, respect, and standing up for what was right. The demonstration was scheduled for 1,400 hours on the main training ground, a large concrete area surrounded by bleachers where the audience could watch and learn from the techniques being shown. As Sarah walked toward the training ground that afternoon, she carried with her the same quiet confidence that had sustained her through every challenge in her life. She had no way of knowing that she was walking toward a confrontation that would become legendary in military circles, a moment when the collision between prejudice and principle would create something that none of them expected. The concrete beneath her feet would soon bear witness to a lesson about respect that none of them would ever forget. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the training ground as 282 Navy SEALs and other special operations personnel filled the bleachers surrounding the concrete demonstration area. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation, but beneath the surface, currents of tension flowed like an underground river ready to burst forth. Sarah stood with the other demonstration participants near the equipment shed, reviewing the planned sequences they would perform. The demonstration was designed to showcase various close-quarters combat techniques, with each participant taking turns to demonstrate specific skills while instructors provided commentary for the audience. Master Chief Peterson, the lead instructor, was a 20-year veteran who commanded respect through competence rather than intimidation. He had specifically requested Sarah for this demonstration because her technique was flawless and her ability to adapt to different scenarios was exceptional. Martinez, he said quietly as they prepared to begin, remember, this is about teaching, not showing off. Execute the techniques exactly as we practiced, and let the work speak for itself. Sarah nodded, understanding the subtle message. In a room full of alpha personalities, staying humble while demonstrating excellence was a delicate balance. But she had learned that lesson years ago from her mother's simple wisdom about respecting yourself and letting the world follow. As the demonstration began, the first few participants went through their routines smoothly. The audience watched with professional interest, taking mental notes and occasionally asking technical questions. The atmosphere was collegial and focused on learning. Then it was Sarah's turn. She stepped onto the mat wearing standard training gear, military fatigues, combat boots, and protective padding. At 5 feet 4 inches, she looked small in the center of the large concrete area, surrounded by nearly 300 special operations personnel who averaged 6 feet tall and 200 pounds. Master Chief Peterson introduced her to the audience. Sergeant Martinez will demonstrate adaptive close-quarters techniques, focusing on leverage and momentum rather than brute strength. These techniques are particularly valuable in situations where size and strength advantages are limited. Sarah began her demonstration, moving through a series of defensive techniques against multiple attackers. Her movements were precise and fluid, displaying years of training and natural athleticism. She demonstrated how proper technique could overcome significant size disadvantages, using an opponent's momentum against them and finding leverage points that maximized her effectiveness. The audience watched with growing interest. Even the skeptics had to acknowledge that her technique was impressive. She moved with a grace and efficiency that spoke to deep understanding of the principles being demonstrated. But in one section of the bleachers, a group of about 15 SEALs, led by Senior Petty Officer Jackson, were having a different reaction. Jackson had been vocal about his opposition to women in special operations, and seeing Sarah receive positive attention only intensified his anger. During a brief break in the demonstration, Jackson leaned over to the men around him. This is exactly what I'm talking about. They put on these shows to make it look like anyone can do our job. But when the real shooting starts, who do you think is going to carry the wounded? Who's going to kick down the doors? His comments found receptive ears among men who shared his views. The group began to feed off each other's frustration, their voices growing louder and more aggressive. Master Chief Peterson noticed the disturbance and shot a warning look toward Jackson's section, but the demonstration continued. Sarah was unaware of the growing hostility in part of the audience, focused entirely on executing her techniques with precision. As she moved into the final sequence of her demonstration, something shifted in the crowd. Jackson stood up suddenly, his voice cutting across the training ground like a knife. "Show respect," he shouted, his words carrying clearly in the afternoon air. The demonstration stopped. Sarah paused mid-movement, looking toward the source of the interruption. Master Chief Peterson stepped forward, his face darkening with anger at the breach of protocol. Senior Petty Officer Jackson, sit down and maintain proper behavior, Peterson commanded. But Jackson was beyond listening to orders. Months of resentment had been building, and the sight of Sarah demonstrating techniques to an audience of elite warriors had pushed him past his breaking point. "I said show respect." Jackson roared again, this time jumping down from the bleachers and walking toward the demonstration area. "This is our house, and we deserve respect." Other members of his group began to follow, their faces flushed with anger and mob mentality taking hold. What had started as one man's outburst was quickly becoming something much more dangerous. Sarah stood in the center of the training area, watching as 15 angry SEALs approached her. Behind them, the rest of the audience sat in shocked silence, unsure whether this was part of the demonstration or a real confrontation. Master Chief Peterson moved quickly to intercede. "Stand down. All of you, return to your seats immediately." But his commands were lost in the noise as Jackson's group continued their advance. "You think you can come into our world and play soldier?" Jackson snarled as he reached the edge of the mat. "You think those pretty techniques will work when bullets are flying and people are dying?" Sarah looked at the angry faces surrounding her and felt something familiar settle in her chest. It was the same feeling she had experienced as a child when bullies had tried to intimidate her. The same feeling she had felt during her first days in basic training when drill sergeants had attempted to break her spirit. But this time was different. This wasn't just about her. As the commanding officer had reminded her weeks earlier, she was representing something larger than herself. Every woman who had ever dreamed of serving at the highest levels was watching through her eyes. Every person who had ever been told they weren't good enough because of their size, their gender, or their background was standing in her shoes. "I'm not playing at anything," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying clearly across the training ground. "I'm here because I earned the right to be here, just like all of you." Jackson's face twisted with rage. "Earned? You think getting special treatment because of your gender is earning something?" The circle of hostile men had tightened around Sarah, and the situation was rapidly spiraling out of control. In the bleachers, other SEALs were beginning to stand, some moving to support Jackson, others looking uncomfortable with the direction things were taking. Master Chief Peterson was speaking rapidly into his radio, calling for military police and senior command to respond to the situation. But help was minutes away, and the confrontation was happening now. Sarah took a deep breath and drew on everything her mother had taught her about standing tall in the face of adversity. She thought about every challenge she had overcome, every person who had doubted her abilities, every moment when she had chosen courage over comfort. "You want to talk about respect?" she said, her voice growing stronger. "Respect isn't something you demand from others. It's something you earn through your actions. And right now, your actions are showing me exactly how little respect you deserve." The words hit Jackson like a physical blow. He had expected fear, submission, or at least anger that would justify his aggression. Instead, he got quiet dignity and a challenge to his behavior that cut to the heart of his insecurity. "You arrogant little—" Jackson started forward, his fists clenched. "That's enough." Master Chief Peterson's voice boomed across the training ground as he forced his way through the crowd. But as he reached for Jackson's arm, one of the other men shoved him backward. What happened next shocked everyone present. Jackson drew back his right leg and kicked Sarah hard in the ribs, the impact lifting her off her feet and sending her stumbling backward. The crack of his boot against her body echoed across the concrete like a gunshot. The crowd gasped, but before anyone could react, another SEAL kicked Sarah from behind, driving her to her knees. Then another. The mob mentality had taken complete control, and what had started as verbal intimidation had exploded into physical violence. Sarah hit the concrete hard, the breath knocked from her lungs, and pain shooting through her ribs where Jackson's boot had connected. For a moment, the world spun around her, and she could hear the shouts and confusion of the crowd as if from a great distance. But as she knelt there on the concrete, feeling the eyes of 282 Special Operations personnel watching her, Sarah made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She could stay down, accept the humiliation, and let these men prove their point about women not belonging in their world. Or she could stand up. Sarah pushed herself to her feet, blood trickling from a cut on her lip, and her uniform torn from the kicks. She stood in the center of the circle of hostile men, surrounded by nearly 300 of the world's most elite warriors, and did something that no one expected. She smiled. Not a cruel smile or a mocking smile, but the quiet smile of someone who had finally found the moment she had been preparing for her entire life. This was her moment of truth, the test that would reveal everything she was made of. "Is that all you've got?" she asked quietly. The question hung in the air like a challenge thrown down before an army. Jackson and his group stood frozen, unsure how to respond to a victim who refused to be victimized, a target who wouldn't break under their pressure. In the bleachers, 267 other SEALs watched in fascination and growing unease as they realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. Some felt shame at what their colleagues were doing. Others felt curiosity about how this small woman would respond to overwhelming odds. All of them sensed that they were about to see something that would be talked about for years to come. Sarah wiped the blood from her lip with the back of her hand and looked around the circle of men surrounding her. "You demanded respect," she said calmly. "Now let me show you what respect really looks like." What happened next would become the stuff of legend in military circles, a story told and retold wherever special operations personnel gathered. It was the moment when quiet determination met explosive prejudice, and the collision created something that none of them had expected to see. Sarah stood in the center of the concrete training ground, surrounded by 15 angry Navy SEALs while 267 others watched from the bleachers. Blood trickled from her split lip, her ribs ached from the kicks she had received, and her uniform was torn. By every logical measure, she was outmatched, outnumbered, and in serious danger. But logic had never been Sarah's strongest weapon. Her greatest strength had always been her refusal to accept defeat, her ability to find opportunity in impossibility, and her deep understanding that respect isn't given, it's earned. Jackson stepped forward, emboldened by the blood he had drawn and the support of his followers. "You want to play with the big boys? Let's see how tough you really are." He swung a massive right hand towards Sarah's head, a blow that would have knocked most people unconscious. But Sarah had spent years studying leverage and momentum, learning to use an opponent's aggression against them. She ducked under the punch, grabbed Jackson's extended arm, and used his own momentum to send him stumbling past her. The crowd in the bleachers erupted in surprised shouts. They had expected to see a small woman overwhelmed by superior force. Instead, they watched her move with fluid precision, turning Jackson's size and aggression into liabilities. Jackson spun around, his face red with embarrassment and rage. "You got lucky," he snarled, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. Sarah didn't respond with words. She had learned long ago that actions spoke louder than threats. She simply stood ready, balanced on the balls of her feet, her hands relaxed at her sides, but her eyes alert and focused. Two of Jackson's supporters rushed her simultaneously from different angles, thinking they could overwhelm her with numbers. Sarah waited until the last possible moment, then dropped low and swept the legs of the first attacker while driving her elbow into the solar plexus of the second. Both men went down hard, one gasping for breath, the other clutching his knee where it had impacted the concrete. The remaining members of Jackson's group hesitated, beginning to realize that this wasn't going according to their plan. They had expected fear and submission. Instead, they were facing someone who seemed to grow calmer and more focused as the pressure increased. In the bleachers, Master Chief Peterson was shouting into his radio, demanding immediate backup while trying to maintain some semblance of order. Other SEALs were on their feet, some moving toward the exits, others pressing closer to get a better view of the unprecedented confrontation. But most of the audience sat transfixed, watching something they had never seen before. This wasn't about superior training or advanced techniques. This was about something deeper, something that couldn't be taught in any school or learned from any manual. Jackson regrouped his remaining supporters, realizing that individual attacks weren't working. Altogether, he commanded, "Show this little girl what happens when you disrespect the SEALs." 8 men rushed Sarah simultaneously from all directions. In the bleachers, spectators gasped, certain they were about to witness a brutal beating that would end Sarah's military career and possibly her life. What they saw instead defied belief. Sarah moved like water flowing around obstacles, never standing still long enough for any attacker to land a solid blow. She used their numbers against them, positioning herself so that their own teammates blocked their attacks. When one man grabbed for her, she used his grip as leverage to drive her knee into another attacker's midsection. When two men tried to corner her against the equipment shed, she vaulted over a fallen teammate and left them stumbling into each other. But Sarah wasn't just avoiding damage. She was systematically dismantling Jackson's group with surgical precision. Every movement served multiple purposes, escaping immediate danger while positioning herself for counterattacks that targeted vulnerable points with devastating effectiveness. When Petty Officer Morrison, one of Jackson's strongest supporters, lunged for her with both arms extended, Sarah caught his right wrist, stepped into his momentum, and used a textbook hip throw that sent his 220-pound frame flying through the air. He landed hard on his back, the impact driving all the air from his lungs and leaving him gasping like a fish. Petty Officer Williams tried to grab her from behind, wrapping his arms around her waist in what should have been an inescapable bear hug. Instead of struggling against his strength, Sarah dropped her weight, drove her elbows back into his ribs, then grabbed his pinky fingers and bent them backward with precisely applied pressure. Williams screamed and released her immediately, clutching his damaged hands. The crowd watched in amazement as Sarah continued to dismantle attackers who outweighed her by 50 to 80 pounds each. She wasn't relying on brute force or lucky shots. Every technique was precise, every movement calculated for maximum effect with minimum wasted energy. Seaman Davis rushed her with a wild haymaker punch that telegraphed its arrival from 3 feet away. Sarah sidestepped the clumsy attack, caught his extended arm, and executed a perfect armbar takedown that left him face down on the concrete with Sarah controlling his shoulder and elbow joints. One slight increase in pressure would have dislocated or broken his arm. Instead, she applied just enough force to immobilize him completely. "Submit," she said quietly. "I submit. I submit." Davis gasped, his face pressed against the concrete. Sarah released him and stood up, looking around at Jackson's remaining supporters. Half of his original group was down, groaning on the concrete or clutching injured limbs. The others stood in a loose circle, their earlier confidence evaporating as they realized they were facing something far beyond their experience. But Jackson himself wasn't finished. His pride and prejudice had been publicly humiliated, and desperation was driving him beyond rational thought. He pulled a training knife from his belt, its dull blade still capable of causing serious injury. "Enough games," he snarled. "Time to end this." The crowd gasped. Using a weapon, even a training weapon, escalated the situation from a brawl to something much more serious. Several SEALs in the bleachers started moving toward the training ground, recognizing that the confrontation had gone too far. Master Chief Peterson's voice boomed across the compound. "Jackson, stand down immediately. That's a direct order." But Jackson was beyond hearing orders. He advanced on Sarah with the knife held low and forward, his training evident in his stance and movement. This wasn't a street fighter swinging wildly. This was a highly trained special operations soldier using lethal techniques. Sarah saw the knife and felt time slow down around her. She had trained in knife defense extensively, but training was different from reality. One mistake here could cost her life or permanent disability. She circled carefully, staying just outside Jackson's reach while looking for an opening. The remaining members of his group spread out behind her, cutting off escape routes and forcing her to face the knife threat while watching for attacks from behind. Jackson feinted left, then lunged right, the training blade aimed at Sarah's ribs. She twisted away from the main thrust, but felt the dull edge catch her uniform and scrape across her side. A real blade would have opened a serious wound. Without hesitation, Sarah grabbed Jackson's knife hand to the wrist, stepped into his body, and drove her knee up toward his elbow joint. The technique was designed to hyperextend the elbow and force him to drop the weapon. But Jackson was bigger and stronger than her previous opponents, and his training was more extensive. He managed to pull his arm back just enough to avoid the worst of the technique, though the impact still caused him to grunt in pain and loosen his grip on the knife. They grappled for control of the weapon, Jackson using his size advantage to try to overpower her, while Sarah used leverage and technique to neutralize his strength. The crowd watched in tense silence as the two fighters struggled, both highly trained but fighting for very different reasons. Jackson was fighting to prove a point about gender and superiority. Sarah was fighting for something deeper. The right to be judged by her actions rather than her appearance, the opportunity to serve her country at the highest level, and the principle that respect should be earned rather than demanded. The struggle for the knife lasted only seconds, but those seconds felt like hours to everyone watching. Finally, Sarah managed to trap Jackson's wrist against her body while driving her forearm up under his elbow. The leverage was perfect, and Jackson had no choice but to release the weapon or risk a dislocated joint. The training knife clattered across the concrete, spinning away from both fighters. But the confrontation wasn't over. Jackson, now weaponless but still dangerous, grabbed for Sarah with both hands, tried to use his size to wrestle her to the ground where his weight advantage would be decisive. Sarah had been expecting this. As Jackson's hands closed on her shoulders, she dropped her weight and rolled backward, using his momentum to throw him over her head in a perfect sacrifice throw. Jackson flew through the air and landed hard on his back, his head striking the concrete with a sound that made the entire crowd wince. He lay still for a moment, dazed by the impact. Sarah rolled to her feet and stood over him, but she didn't press her advantage. Instead, she extended her hand to help him up. Jackson stared at the offered hand in confusion. He had just tried to seriously injure her, had led a group of men in attacking her, had escalated the confrontation to potentially lethal levels. And she was offering to help him to his feet. "I don't need your help," he mumbled, rolling away from her hand and struggling to stand on his own. "I know you don't," Sarah replied quietly, "but I'm offering it anyway, because that's what respect looks like." The words hit Jackson harder than any physical blow could have. Around the training ground, his supporters were picking themselves up from the concrete, nursing bruises, scraped palms, and damaged pride. Not one of them had been seriously injured despite the intensity of the confrontation, and they were beginning to realize why. Sarah hadn't been trying to hurt them. Every technique she had used was designed to neutralize threats while minimizing permanent damage. She could have broken bones, dislocated joints, or caused serious injuries. Instead, she had systematically defeated 15 trained fighters while ensuring that all of them would go home to their families intact. The crowd in the bleachers was absolutely silent, processing what they had just witnessed. In 5 minutes, a 5 feet 4 inches woman had redefined their understanding of strength, courage, and what it meant to be a warrior. But the confrontation wasn't quite over. As Jackson struggled to his feet, his pride wounded more than his body, he looked around at his defeated supporters and made one final desperate attempt to salvage something from the humiliation. "This isn't over," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying clearly in the silence. "You think you've won something here? You think this proves you belong?" Sarah looked at Jackson, then at his supporters, then up at the crowd in the bleachers. 282 of the world's most elite warriors were waiting to see how she would respond to the threat, how she would handle victory, whether she would show mercy or cruelty in triumph. Her response would determine not just how this day ended, but how it would be remembered for years to come. Sarah looked at Jackson standing before her, his uniform disheveled, his pride shattered, but his defiance still burning in his eyes. Around them, 15 Navy SEALs were slowly picking themselves up from the concrete, each one nursing injuries to their bodies and their assumptions about strength and capability. In the bleachers, 267 Special Operations personnel sat in absolute silence, processing something they had never expected to witness. The air was thick with tension and anticipation as they waited to see how Sarah would respond to Jackson's final challenge. "You want to know if this proves I belong?" Sarah asked quietly, her voice carrying clearly across the training ground. She wiped blood from her split lip and looked around at the faces surrounding her, some hostile, some curious, some beginning to show something that might have been respect. "This doesn't prove I belong," she continued. "Malasia record, provas primeras balón." My service proves I belong. My willingness to stand here and face 15 of you at once proves I belong. She took a step closer to Jackson, and he instinctively tensed, expecting another attack. Instead, Sarah's voice became even quieter, forcing him to strain to hear her words. But you want to know what this really proves? It proves that respect isn't something you can demand through fear or violence. It's something you earn through your actions, your character, and how you treat others when you think no one important is watching. Jackson's face flushed red again, but before he could respond, Sarah continued. You kicked me while I was down. You brought a weapon to what should have been a teaching moment. You turned a professional demonstration into a mob attack. And through it all, you kept talking about respect. She gestured to his supporters, who were now standing in a loose group behind him, their earlier aggression replaced by embarrassment and uncertainty. Look at them, Jackson. Look at the men who followed you. Do you think they respect you more now than they did an hour ago? Do you think anyone in those bleachers is impressed by your leadership today? Jackson opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. For the first time since the confrontation began, he seemed to really see what had happened. His supporters wouldn't meet his eyes. In the bleachers, SEALs who had initially cheered his aggression were now looking away in shame. You want to know what respect looks like? Sarah asked. It looks like Master Chief Peterson, who recommended me for this program based on my performance, not my politics. It looks like the men in my unit who trust me to watch their backs, because I've proven I will. It looks like my mother, who raised 3 children on a waitress salary and never once asked for special treatment or made excuses for our circumstances. Her voice grew stronger as she continued. Respect looks like standing up for what's right even when you're outnumbered 15-1. It looks like using only the force necessary to defend yourself and going home at night knowing you didn't cause permanent harm to people who were trying to hurt you. Jackson stared at her, his anger slowly being replaced by something more complicated. Around him, his supporters were beginning to understand the lesson they had just received. They had expected to teach Sarah about power and intimidation. Instead, she had taught them about strength and character. But Sarah wasn't finished. She had something more to say, something that had been building inside her since the first day she walked onto this base and felt the weight of skeptical stares. You think I'm here because of political correctness or lowered standards, she said, addressing not just Jackson but the entire crowd. You think someone gave me special treatment because I'm a woman. Let me tell you something about special treatment. She pulled off her torn uniform shirt, revealing the scars that crisscrossed her arms and torso, evidence of 5 years of combat deployments, training accidents, and close calls that few people ever survived. I got this scar in Fallujah when my convoy hit an IED, and I spent 4 hours pulling wounded Marines out of burning vehicles while under sniper fire. I got this one in Afghanistan when my patrol was ambushed, and I provided covering fire for a medical evacuation while shrapnel tore through my shoulder. The crowd was completely silent now, even Jackson's supporters staring at the physical evidence of Sarah's service and sacrifice. I got this one during SEER training when I spent 3 days evading capture in the mountains with a dislocated shoulder because quitting wasn't an option. And I got these, she pointed to a series of smaller scars on her hands and forearms from 5 years of training with the same weapons, the same equipment, and the same standards as every man in this program. She put her shirt back on and looked directly at Jackson. So when you talk about special treatment, remember this. I've bled for the same flag you have. I've risked my life for the same mission you have. And I've earned my place here through the same blood, sweat, and sacrifice that brought every one of you to this program. The silence that followed was profound. Even Jackson seemed to be processing her words, his earlier certainty replaced by something that might have been doubt about his own assumptions. But the real surprise came from an unexpected source. Master Chief Peterson, who had been coordinating the response to the confrontation, stepped into the center of the training ground with military police flanking him on both sides. Senior Petty Officer Jackson, he said formally, his voice carrying the full authority of his rank and experience. You and your supporters are under arrest for assault on military personnel, conduct unbecoming, and violation of direct orders. Jackson's face went pale. In his anger and prejudice, he had forgotten that his actions had been witnessed by nearly 300 people, many of whom outranked him significantly. There would be no way to explain away what had happened or spin it as anything other than a criminal assault on a fellow service member. Master Chief, Jackson started, but Peterson cut him off. You have the right to remain silent, Peterson continued, following military protocol. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court-martial proceeding. As the military police began placing restraints on Jackson and his supporters, something remarkable happened. Sarah stepped forward and addressed Master Chief Peterson directly. Master Chief, I request that you consider alternative disciplinary action for these men. Peterson stared at her in amazement. Sergeant Martinez, these men just committed assault and battery against you in front of 282 witnesses. They used weapons and threatened your life. You're asking me to go easy on them. Sarah looked at Jackson, who was staring at her with an expression of complete confusion. I'm asking you to consider what would best serve the military and these men's families. Court-martial proceedings will end their careers and destroy their families' financial security. That's not justice. That's revenge. She turned to address the crowd in the bleachers. We're all here because we volunteered to serve something bigger than ourselves. We took an oath to protect people who can't protect themselves and to uphold values that are bigger than our personal prejudices. Her voice carried clearly across the training ground as she continued. These men made a mistake today, a serious mistake that could have had tragic consequences. But destroying their lives won't undo what happened, and it won't make our military stronger. Jackson found his voice at last. Why? He asked, his earlier hostility replaced by genuine bewilderment. After what we did to you, why would you try to help us? Sarah looked at him for a long moment before answering. Because that's what we do. We're supposed to protect people, even from their own worst impulses. And because I've learned something that maybe you haven't yet, true strength isn't about proving you're better than someone else. It's about lifting others up, even when they've tried to tear you down. Master Chief Peterson stood quietly for several minutes, considering Sarah's request while looking at the faces of Jackson and his supporters. These were highly trained special operations personnel whose skills and experience represented millions of dollars in training and years of development. Ending their careers would be a significant loss to national security, regardless of their personal failings. Finally, he spoke. Senior Petty Officer Jackson, by rights you and your men should be facing federal assault charges and dishonorable discharge. The only reason you're not is because Sergeant Martinez has requested mercy on your behalf. He paused, letting the weight of those words sink in. However, mercy doesn't mean there are no consequences. You will all face non-judicial punishment, reduction in rank, forfeiture of pay, and extensive additional training on military conduct and equal treatment policies. Jackson nodded silently, beginning to understand the magnitude of what Sarah had done for him. She had the power to destroy his career and chose instead to preserve it while ensuring he learned from his mistakes. But Master Chief Peterson wasn't finished. He turned to address the entire crowd in the bleachers. Today you witnessed something that I hope you'll remember for the rest of your careers. You saw what real strength looks like, what true courage means, and what it means to earn respect rather than demand it. He gestured towards Sarah, who was now receiving medical attention for her injuries, while declining suggestions that she should go to the hospital. Sergeant Martinez didn't just defend herself today. She defended the principle that we judge people by their actions and character rather than their appearance or background. She showed mercy when she could have sought revenge, and she demonstrated the kind of leadership and moral courage that our military desperately needs. The crowd began to stir as Peterson's words sank in. In the space of one afternoon, their assumptions about strength, courage, and respect had been completely rewritten. But the most powerful moment was yet to come. As the military police finished processing Jackson and his supporters, preparing to escort them for further disciplinary action, Jackson broke away from his escorts and approached Sarah one final time. She tensed, unsure of his intentions after everything that had happened. But instead of anger or threats, Jackson did something that surprised everyone present. He extended his hand to her. "Sergeant Martinez," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology, and my respect." Sarah looked at his offered hand for a moment, then reached out and shook it firmly. Apology accepted, Senior Petty Officer. But the respect you'll have to earn through your future actions. Jackson nodded, understanding that this was just the beginning of a long journey toward redemption. As he walked away with the military police, he carried with him a lesson about true strength that would change the rest of his life. In the bleachers, 267 Navy SEALs and other special operations personnel began to file out quietly, each one carrying their own lessons from what they had witnessed. The story of what happened on the training ground that day would spread through military communities around the world, becoming a legend about courage, character, and the power of standing up for what's right. But for Sarah Martinez, standing alone on the concrete where she had faced impossible odds and emerged victorious, the real victory wasn't in the fight she had won. It was in the principles she had upheld and the mercy she had shown, proving that true warriors fight not just to win, but to make the world a little bit better than they found it. 6 months later, Sarah Martinez stood in the same spot on the training ground where her life had changed forever. The concrete had been repaired and repainted, but she could still see the exact place where she had faced 15 attackers and emerged victorious through skill, courage, and an unshakable commitment to doing what was right. The cross-training program had concluded, and today was her graduation ceremony. But this wasn't the small, routine event that had originally been planned. Word of what happened on that September afternoon had spread throughout the military community and beyond, transforming Sarah's graduation into something much larger and more significant. Present in the audience were high-ranking officers from every branch of the military, representatives from Congress, and journalists from major news outlets. The Secretary of Defense had personally flown in to attend the ceremony, along with the chiefs of staff from multiple branches of the armed forces. But for Sarah, the most important people in the audience were sitting in the front row. Her mother Maria, her 2 younger siblings, and Master Chief Peterson, who had become not just an instructor, but a mentor and friend. Also present, though sitting separately and wearing dress uniforms instead of their usual combat gear, were Jackson and the 14 other SEALs who had attacked her 6 months earlier. Their presence was part of their rehabilitation program, designed to help them understand the full impact of their actions and learn from their mistakes. The ceremony began with standard military protocol, but everyone present knew this was far from a standard event. When Sarah's name was called to receive her completion certificate, the applause was thunderous and sustained, lasting nearly 5 minutes as the entire audience rose to their feet. But the real surprise came when the Secretary of Defense took the podium for what was supposed to be brief closing remarks. Instead, he announced that Sarah was being awarded the Defense Meritorious Service Medal for her actions during the incident 6 months earlier. Sergeant Martinez, the Secretary said, on September 15th of this year, you faced a situation that would have broken most people. You were outnumbered, outweighed, and under attack by 15 highly trained special operations personnel. But instead of retreating or submitting to intimidation, you stood your ground and defended not just yourself, but the principles that make our military strong. The audience listened in rapt attention as the Secretary continued. But what makes your actions truly remarkable wasn't your physical courage, impressive as that was. It was your moral courage. You showed mercy to people who had shown you none. You protected the careers and families of men who had tried to destroy yours. And you turned a moment of hatred and prejudice into a lesson about respect, character, and what it truly means to be a warrior. As the Secretary pinned a medal to Sarah's uniform, she looked out at the audience and saw something she had never expected to see. Jackson and his former supporters were among the people applauding most enthusiastically. The 6 months of counseling, training, and reflection had transformed their understanding of what had happened that day. After the ceremony, as Sarah mingled with family, friends, and military officials, Jackson approached her one final time. He looked different, humbler, more thoughtful, carrying himself with a quiet dignity that hadn't been there before. Sergeant Martinez, he said formally, I wanted to thank you again for what you did for me and my men. And I wanted you to know that I've requested a transfer to instructor duty. I want to spend the rest of my career teaching other people the lessons you taught me. Sarah smiled and extended her hand. I think you'll be an excellent instructor, senior petty officer. Just remember that the best teachers are the ones who never stop learning themselves. Jackson shook her hand firmly. I'll remember that. And I'll make sure every student I teach understands what real strength looks like. As the crowd began to disperse, Sarah found herself alone with her family for the first time in months. Her mother, Maria, pulled her aside and looked into her eyes with the same intensity she had shown when Sarah was a child. Mija, she said quietly, using the Spanish endearment that always made Sarah feel like a little girl again. I want you to know how proud I am of you. Not just for what you accomplished, but for how you accomplished it. Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes. Mama, I just did what you taught me. I remembered who I was and stood tall in my truth. Maria nodded, her own eyes glistening with unshed tears. Yes, but you did more than that. You showed mercy to people who didn't deserve it. You chose to heal rather than hurt. That's not something I taught you. That came from your own heart. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Master Chief Peterson, who had been watching the family reunion from a respectful distance. Sergeant Martinez, he said formally, then broke into a grin. Sarah, I have some news that I think you'll find interesting. Sarah raised an eyebrow, curious about what could be important enough to interrupt her family time. Peterson continued, his excitement barely contained. The incident 6 months ago has sparked a complete review of military policies regarding integration and equal treatment. But more than that, it's led to the creation of a new training program that's going to be implemented across all branches of the military. He pulled out a folder and handed it to Sarah. It's called the Martinez Protocol, and it's designed to teach military personnel about unconscious bias, conflict resolution, and moral courage under pressure. The program uses your actions as a case study in leadership and character. Sarah opened the folder and scanned the documents inside. The program was comprehensive, involving role-playing exercises, ethical discussions, and real-world scenarios designed to help military personnel understand their own prejudices and learn to overcome them. But here's the best part, Peterson continued. They want you to help develop and lead the program. It would mean a promotion to staff sergeant and assignment to the Pentagon as a special advisor on military culture and integration. Sarah stared at the documents, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was being offered. 6 months earlier, she had been fighting just to prove she belonged in the military. Now she was being asked to help reshape military culture for an entire generation of service members. I don't know what to say, she admitted. Say yes, her mother interjected firmly. This is your chance to make sure no other young woman has to face what you faced. This is your chance to change the world. Sarah looked around at the faces surrounding her, her family, her mentor, and in the distance, the men who had once been her enemies and were now learning to be better versions of themselves. She thought about all the young women and men who would serve in the military in the years to come, and how different their experiences might be if the lessons of that September afternoon could be spread throughout the armed forces. Yes, she said quietly, then louder, yes, I accept. 3 years later, the Martinez Protocol had been implemented in every branch of the U.S. military and had been adopted by allied forces around the world. Incidents of discrimination and harassment had dropped dramatically, while measures of unit cohesion and effectiveness had improved significantly. Sarah, now a master sergeant and one of the youngest senior advisors in Pentagon history, continued to teach and refine the program. She traveled to military bases around the world, sharing her story and helping others understand that true strength comes not from the ability to dominate others, but from the wisdom to lift them up. Jackson, true to his word, had become one of the military's most respected instructors in character and leadership development. He frequently worked alongside Sarah, using his own transformation as an example of how people could change when given the opportunity and motivation to do better. The two of them often returned to the training ground where it all began, bringing new classes of military personnel to stand on the same concrete, where prejudice had met principle and principle had won. The stories they told weren't about victory in combat or superiority over enemies, but about the harder and more important battle for the soul of an institution and a nation. During one such visit, a young female recruit asked Sarah what she thought about most when she looked back on that day. Sarah considered the question carefully before answering. "I think about choices," she said finally. Every person who was here that day had choices to make. Jackson and his supporters chose to act on their prejudices. The crowd in the bleachers chose whether to intervene or remain silent. I chose how to respond to violence and hatred. She gestured to the training ground around them. But the most important choice came afterward. Jackson chose to learn from his mistakes and become a better person. The military leadership chose to examine their policies and make changes. And all of us chose to turn a moment of darkness into an opportunity for light. The young recruit nodded thoughtfully. "What would you say to someone facing their own impossible situation?" Sarah smiled, remembering another young woman who had once asked her mother the same question in different words. "I would say remember who you are. Stand tall in your truth. And never forget that the hardest battles aren't fought against external enemies. They're fought for the values and principles that make us who we want to be." As the sun set over the training ground that evening, casting long shadows across the concrete, where Sarah had once faced impossible odds, she reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought her to this moment. She had started that day simply trying to demonstrate some combat techniques to a military audience. She had ended it by demonstrating something far more important. That courage isn't about being unafraid. It's about doing what's right despite your fear. That strength isn't about overpowering others. It's about lifting them up. And that respect isn't something you can demand or take. It's something you earn through your actions, your character, and your willingness to stand up for what's right, even when you're standing alone. The training ground was quiet now, but the lessons learned there continued to echo through military communities around the world. And in Pentagon offices and military academies, on bases and ships and forward operating posts, a new generation of warriors was learning that the most important battles aren't always fought with weapons and tactics. Sometimes they're fought with mercy, understanding, and the quiet courage to choose healing over revenge, growth over punishment, and hope over hatred. These were the lessons of Sarah Martinez, a small woman from a small town who had stood against impossible odds and emerged victorious not through force, but through the unshakable strength of her convictions and the power of choosing to do what was right, regardless of the cost. Her story had become legend, but more importantly, it had become a roadmap for others to follow, a reminder that real warriors don't just fight to win battles. They fight to make the world a better place for everyone who comes after them. And in that mission, Sarah Martinez had achieved the greatest victory of all: the transformation of an institution, a culture, and hundreds of thousands of hearts and minds who would carry her lessons forward into an uncertain but hopeful future. The concrete training ground had been repaired and repainted, but the impact of what happened there would last forever, carved not in stone, but in the characters of everyone who learned that true strength comes not from the ability to defeat others, but from the wisdom to help them become better versions of themselves. That was Sarah Martinez's true legacy. Not the fight she won, but the peace she made possible for generations of warriors who would serve long after her story had passed in a legend.